Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is your teacher, Mr. Hess. Today I wanted to do a recap with y'all over Module 25. Okay, Module 25 was all about the process by which banks create money. Okay, and we call that process of banks creating money multiple deposit expansion. Okay, so this video is going to recap mainly Module 25, but again, some of the concepts you looked at in your textbook over Module 23 and Module 24. The first thing I want to take a look at is the idea of the reserve requirement. Okay, the reserve requirement we said was capital R, capital R. Okay, the reserve requirement is the dollar amount by which the Federal Reserve banking system requires banks to have on hand at any point in time. Remember that, as a consumer, you're more than allowed to go to your bank whenever you want to take out whatever money you want that's your own. It's your money. Now, the Fed chooses what they want that reserve requirement to be by manipulating what we call the required reserve ratio. Okay, and that is actually the percentage of the demand deposits. All right, like recapping, we said demand deposits are checking accounts, and it's the percentage of those checking accounts that cannot be loaned out. Usually, that number is set at 10%. Okay, now I've got a couple of tips and tricks, and we talked about this in class, but the AP test is only going to throw 4 numbers at you for knowing on the required reserve ratio. Okay, it's only going to be 5, 10, 20, or 25%. Now, College Board won't deviate from this with the FRQs because you're going to have to do some calculations, and you are not allowed to use a calculator on the AP test. So any of the math that they're going to require you to do must be math by which you can do, relatively easy. Okay, and so all that math right there will either deal with 5, 10, 20, or 25%. Well, that brings us on to the next concept, which is the money multiplier. We learned about the spending multiplier when we learned about fiscal policy, right? How the government, could change spending, or the government could change taxes, and it won't just be that initial amount by which we see the economy change. It'll have a multiplier effect down the way. We also see this with this thing called the money multiplier. Anytime you deposit money inside of the bank is going to take your money and they're going to loan it out to new people. Well, the rate by which the money is able to grow really depends on how much the bank is required to keep in their vault. So if you've got a bank that's required to keep a large amount of money in their vault, the economy won't grow as quickly. Now, the way we figure out the money multiplier is taking 1 divided by whatever the required reserve ratio is, or 1 divided by RR%. So hypothetically, say that the Federal Reserve wanted to set the reserve ratio at 25%. They wanted to go for that, the highest rate we'll see on the AP exam. Well, in that case, the multiplier would be 4. And we know that because 1 divided by 0.25 is equal to 4. All right, so looking at your next slide, looking at slide 5, okay, the AP test is only going to use, 4 numbers for the money multipliers. Now, these money multipliers that they're going to use, we figure those out from the 4 required reserve ratios that they gave us earlier. So, for example, if the bank is required to keep 5%, our money multiplier would be equal to 1 divided by 5%, which is 1 divided by 0.05. Well, we want to figure out how many times does 0.05 go into one whole, and that's going to be 20. All right, we're going to do that all the way down. For 10%, the multiplier would be 10. For 20%, the multiplier would be 5. For 25%, the multiplier would be 4. So it sometimes helps students to think about money when they're solving this. You can think in terms of, how many nickels, how many dimes, how many quarters, fit within a dollar. The other way we talked about in class is setting this up algebraically. If I'm trying to do 5%, how many times does 5% go into one whole? Well, I could do 5x equals 100. If I divide both sides by 5, x would then equal 20. So it doesn't really matter which way we do it. A couple different ways will set us up in the right direction. So this brings us to slide 6. And we all should be very familiar with setting up our problems in this format. Okay? Whenever we have to do questions of multiple deposit expansion on the AP test, they're always going to give us 2 things. They're always going to tell us how much the deposit was. When somebody puts money inside the bank, how much money do they put inside of the bank? And they're also going to tell us how much are they required to keep via the required reserve ratio. Now, if we know those 2 things, if we know how much somebody puts inside the bank, and if we know how much they're required to keep what percentage of all deposits they have to keep. Well, from there we can figure out things like the required reserves, the excess reserves, and we can figure out our money multiplier. So, for example, let's say that we have a deposit, and let's say we're going to put in $200. All right. So you can do this on your paper if you want to. Let's say we have a deposit for $200, and at $200, let's say that banks are required to keep 25%. All right, they have to keep 25% of every deposit put in. All right, so at 25%, we want to figure out how much would they then be required to keep. So we want to figure out what are the actual required reserves, what are the excess reserves, and also what is our money multiplier. So we want to figure out 25% of $200, and anytime you're doing a quarter is always half of a half. So if you struggle with math, take your deposit amount, divide that by half. So 200 divided by 2 would give me 100, and we're going to take that and divide it by half again. 100 divided by 2 would give me 50. So my required reserves are going to be $50. And again, be very sure that you always have whatever your unit of measure is. In this case, we're using dollars, so you have to have a dollar sign. To figure out the excess reserves, we're going to take the deposit and we're going to subtract what's required to be kept. In this case, 200 minus 50, excess reserves would be $150. For the money multiplier, remember we're trying to figure out how many times will 25% go into one whole, because for the money multiplier we're doing right here, okay, 1 divided by 0.25, all right, 0.25 being 25%, and we know that there are 4 quarters and a dollar, so the money multiplier would be equal to 4. Okay, so that right there kind of walks us through what we're going to have to do with this. So what I'd like to do with y'all is take a look at the 3 types of questions that the AP test will ask you when it comes to consumers. So the first question that they're going to give us is going to be calculating the maximum amount that the bank can initially lend out. Or in other words, what are the excess reserves? The second question is going to be the maximum change in demand deposits. And finally, calculating the maximum change in our money supply. So go ahead and take a look at slide 8, okay? And the first example I have for y'all is, let's assume that I went to the bank and I deposited $1,000 worth of my cash into my checking account, and that the bank is required to keep 10%. Now the phrasing I have right here, and it's bolded and italicized for you if you want to either underline it or if you want to go ahead and take a picture of it, or highlight it, underline it, whatever you need to do. Determine the maximum amount that the commercial bank can initially lend. Okay, so we want to figure out how much can the bank initially lend out from my $1,000 deposit. So we're going to take $1,000 minus 10% of the $1,000, because that's what's required to be kept. So $1,000 minus $100 would give me $900 in excess reserves. Okay, now once I figure that out, the next thing they're going to want me to figure out is, what is the maximum total change in demand deposits? Okay, what is the maximum total change in demand deposits? And if you remember, the way we had abbreviated this was max delta symbol, okay, max delta symbol, DD. All right, and the max change in our demand deposits, it's going to be whatever is our initial change in reserves. So in this case, it'll be the $1,000 that I decided to put inside of my bank account times whatever my money multiplier is. So $1,000 times 10 would give me a max change in demand deposits of up to $10,000. So me putting $1,000 in the bank could make potentially up to $10,000 new dollars of demand deposits, or $10,000 new dollars worth of checking account money. Now the last thing we want to figure out is, what is the maximum total change in the money supply? Whenever I take my money, okay, whenever I take my money and I want to put it in the bank, we talked about the M1 measure of the money supply. M1 is going to count things like cash and coins, all right, anything we have on hand, and anything that we have inside of our bank. Because a checking account is also a very liquid form of money. You need to be familiar with the idea of liquidity in finance. Okay, liquidity is talking about how easily and how quickly money moves through the economy. And so cash and checking accounts money moves very quickly through the economy. It's accepted almost anywhere. There's very few restrictions on how and when you can use it. So if I deposit that $1,000 worth of cash into my checking account, I took money that was cash that I had in my wallet and I put it into my checking account. I didn't change the M1 measure. All I did is converted my money from cash into being a demand deposit instead. So it's almost like you take money out of your left pocket and you put it in your right pocket. And if I had $1,000 in my left pocket and I move it to my right pocket, I still have $1,000. And so to account for this, we need to subtract. We need to subtract my $1,000 deposit from the max change in the money supply. So I'll end up doing my $10,000 that I had as my max change in demand deposits, subtract my initial $1,000 deposit, and I'll come up with a $9,000 max change in the money supply. Now there's a second way we can solve this. Okay? To do that last step right there, we said we could also do whatever the excess reserves was times our money multiplier. And in this case, if the bank is required to keep $100, I'd have $900 left over as excess reserves times, we said we had a money multiplier of 10, and $900 times 10 would also give me my $9,000 max change in the money supply. So it doesn't matter which way you want to go about solving this. The fact of the matter is you've got a couple of options, which is nice. Okay? So those are going to be how we're going to answer consumer questions. Now when we get to Fed questions, it's a little bit different. Okay? They flip the step 2 and step 3 around on us. But again, if they ask us a question with the Fed, they're going to ask us, calculate the maximum initial change in excess reserves, calculate the change in loans in the banking system, and calculate the change to the money supply. And we won't see it often, but we'll talk about it more in class. Sometimes type 2 and type 3 they'll have the same result if the Fed does not get involved. And so what that means is if they decide not to do any buying or selling of bonds. Okay, so when we're looking at an example like this, there's a couple of key phrases we want to sort of dial in on. If we're given a reserve ratio of 25%, assume that we're going to go ahead and find where I've got the Federal Reserve, okay? Assume that the Federal Reserve purchases, okay, $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market. So I've got a couple words up there that I highlighted, okay? Things that we want to look out for, and that's how we're going to know it's a Fed question instead of a consumer question. The biggest giveaway to a consumer will be that it talks about somebody's name and a deposit. And the Fed, it's going to say the Federal Reserve or the banks. It's also going to use a really big number. Consumers don't go to their banks and, put $100 million worth or take out $100 million worth of money on a regular basis. There are some who do, but that's not the vast majority of us. Okay? The other thing we're going to zero in on is where I've got right here, it says U.S. Treasury securities. Okay? We said another word for bonds. Okay, another word for bonds is securities. So we're talking about buying bonds here. All right? So we want to determine the amount that a single bank can lend out from this purchase of $100 million worth of bonds or securities with a ratio of 25%. So we want to figure out how much is in excess. So they're required to keep $25 million of the $100 million at a 25% ratio, which means they could loan out up to $75 million. Okay, the first part usually is pretty straightforward for students. Now, when we move on to example 2, for this question, what we want to figure out now is the maximum change in loans. All right, we want to find out what is the max change in loans. And so we're looking at max delta loans. Now to do the max change in loans, we're going to take whatever that excess reserve amount was, all right, whatever ER was, and we're going to multiply that times whatever the money multiplier is. So in this case, we know excess reserves is $75 million. We want to figure out the money multiplier. Well, the money multiplier is 1 divided by 25%, or when we convert that over here into a decimal, 1 divided by 0.25. And 1 divided by 0.25 we know will give us our multiplier down here at the bottom of 4. So I'll do $75 million times 4, and that'll give me a maximum change, okay, a maximum change of $300 million. Does not necessarily mean that that's going to be how much will happen. It just means that it could be up to that amount. Okay? And then finally, last but not least, is looking at the max change in the money supply. Now, whenever we're doing a OMO question, and remember we said that OMO refers to a open market operation. Okay, so we're talking about doing this right here on the open market. So an OMO, an open market operation, we're buying bonds in this case. This is different than when we did before. We talked about M1 versus M2, right? If we're talking about things like bonds, securities, that is not in the M1 measure. Bonds and securities can be turned into money, or they can be turned into checkings money, but it requires a conversion process. So we're going to break this money from a higher M number down here to M1. And so by doing so, we are adding brand new money to the consumer money supply. So I could take my answer that I got from the last one, my $300 million when I did my $75 million of excess reserves times my money multiplier of 4 and got $300 million. I could take that $300 million and add my original OMO, which was the $100 million purchase of Treasury securities, and do 300 plus 100 and get the $400 million change. Or I know I could also do my OMO times my money multiplier. And in this case, I would be doing $100 million times a money multiplier of 4, which would also give me my $400 million max change in the money supply. So a couple different ways we can solve it. It doesn't really matter which way we do it, whichever way works best and easiest for you. So I'd like to do a recap for us. And in summary, anytime you put money into the bank is able to create new money by loaning out your deposit. All right? There's a lot of things in place to protect your money. And the biggest thing is the FDIC, that Federal Deposit Insurance. And if that bank ever goes under, the government's going to reimburse you. The most common one we're going to see on the AP test is 10%, but really 5, 10, 20, or 25% are all fair game. You do need to be able to figure out money multipliers based off of the required reserve ratio. And most importantly, okay, I can't stress this enough, make sure you always include whatever your units are. If it's dollars, euros, yens, whatever, always include that. Now, if you're still confused, I've got a list right here of different FRQs you can go online and you can check out. All right? I would strongly recommend, please, I can't stress it enough, go visit my website. All right, go visit my website. All right, Mr. Hess. All right, Mr. Hess dot Yolasite. All right, Mr. Hess dot Yolasite.com. All right, any help that you need will be right there on that website. Okay, I've got every FRQ from 1999 all the way through today. Go on there, get the help you need. Be more than happy to help you all out. Okay, hopefully this video was helpful. And if you have any other questions, as always, please feel free. Shoot me an email. Hit me up at tutoring. You guys have a great day. Bye.